Yeah, my name is Nathan Smith. I was born on April the 16th, 1982 in Jonesboro, Arkansas. So my parents are Philip and Laurie Smith. My dad is from a little town in South Arkansas called Strong. My mother is from an even smaller town in North Louisiana called Spearsville. And so they met and married when my dad became her pastor. My dad's a Baptist preacher, and they met, I guess, in 1978 and got married. And so I grew up a preacher's kid. So I have a younger sister named Hannah, who's married with two of her own children now. And so, like I say, my dad was a Baptist preacher, and so we grew up in a couple of different. We didn't move around as much as some pastors do, but he pastored churches in North Louisiana when I was very young, until I was about 14. And then we moved up to Bentonville in 1996, where he became the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Bentonville. And so grew up here, junior high and high school, and just, have kind of claimed Bentonville home ever since. Well, so Bentonville was a lot smaller place in 1996 than it is now. In fact, I think the Lincoln Junior High now is where the high school was. I think when I graduated at Bentonville, there were, I think, 198 or 298 kids that were in my graduating class. And so obviously it is exponentially larger than that now. And in fact, the town that I moved from, West Monroe, Louisiana, was, believe it or not, a bigger, felt to me a little bit more metropolitan place, if you can believe that, than even Bentonville, except for the Walmart home office that brought so many, unique and different folks here. So Bentonville is a much smaller place, very much a place where you kind of felt like you knew everyone. I had teachers that had been around here for a long time, and so it was very much a place where people still had a lot of memory of Bentonville as it used to be. Bentonville was always the town that was kind of the big, the Rogers, Fayetteville, Springdale was always the smallest. Man, when we go play them in sports, we would struggle, right, because we just didn't have as many kids, and so it was definitely a smaller place. So being a preacher's kid is a unique scenario. When I was growing up, everybody used to always ask me, because people would, for whatever reason, I didn't automatically like people in school or sports clubs or whatever to know that, because once they know that your dad's a pastor, they kind of get an idea of you, some preconceived notions that may or may not be good, but for whatever reason, it was just something I was uncomfortable with. And so people would always ask you, are you going to be a pastor just like your dad and all those things? Now, having attended as a kid some Baptist business meetings, I can tell you that, save the call of God, there was no way I was ever going to do that. Thankfully, God did not call me to be a pastor. But look, it was a great experience. I've often told people, man, just the best people I have known in life have been in the local church. People that they care about you, they care about people. And so it was a great experience. I love the idea of, and I want it for my own children, to be in a community, to be in a small community of people that you can really get to know, that you can walk through life with. And I think one of the problems in society today is we have kind of deconstructed those relationships in smaller communities, be they churches or anything else. I do think church is the best place. But as we have kind of deconstructed that and replaced it, I think, with a lot of times these sort of fake virtual relationships online, I think you see the deficit of that in people's lives. So for me as a preacher's kid, one, I was free labor at the church. So my dad I cut the grass, I moved the chairs. When we moved up here, I remember the church grew quite a bit. I think it went from 200 or 300 people to, over 1,000, and to whatever it is today. I remember we were meeting in a gym at the time at First Baptist, and they finally, a lot of churches, they hadn't spent any money, and so they had a third pews, a third folding chairs, and a third just other plastic chairs. And so it just didn't look good. And so finally the church bought, all these new fancy chairs, which aren't so fancy today. They're still in some of the rooms, but I remember it was my job to bring all of those chairs up and set them up, right? Because why would you hire somebody if you had me? And so I I would do that. I would cut grass and just be a part of all that. But I think, you know, all kidding aside, being a part of the local church, you just get to see how, certainly as a person of faith, how people's lives are impacted by the gospel, how people, you know, can be supported and loved and encouraged in a community like that. And I think it's in those, you know, from my perspective as a person of faith, it's in the local church where the richness of your life really comes out. So for me, I've loved the experience. I loved it as a kid, and even the parts of it that were a little, you know, uncomfortable. Kind of, you always feel like you live in a glass house a little bit, that you're a little bit on display. People know, because there is, you know, the impression that preachers' kids are some of the worst, and often that is true, I will say. And so you do feel a little bit like you're in a glass house, but it gives you a unique perspective in life. You know, I was always the kid whose parents didn't do what everybody else pretty much did, and so that puts you in a little bit different perspective. You know, our summer vacation is often centered around where was the Southern Baptist Convention at that time. So some people would say, well, you know, I went to Disney World or I did this, and I'd say, well, I heard Dr. Adrian Rogers preach, you know, which I enjoyed. But it was a unique experience, and it was something I think that made me comfortable with things that most kids aren't. Like I had to, you know, because I went with my parents' places. I would go to functions and talk to grown-ups, and, you know, just learn to carry on conversations. So, you know, it was a unique experience, and I think it was good for me.
Well, how do you think that experience as a preacher's kid and being around the churches and the people, how did that help you in your career now as a prosecutor and as an attorney?
Yeah. Well, you know, it's strange because as a kid, you know, my dad's always up there talking to people, and so as prosecutor, that's kind of what I do. You know, you talk to people and you learn, and obviously going and hearing lots of other preachers preach, you know who's good, and man, somebody who will just put you right to sleep. You know, that people who you always say, oh, he's a really good person, but, you know, messages are rough, and so you know those kinds of folks. And I think the difference is when you connect with somebody, when you know that what they're saying to you is authentic and that they mean it, and that it matters in your life, that they're not just kind of bound up by cliches. And so I think as an attorney, to me, talking to juries, it's important to just connect with them and understand, listen, most people have a short attention span. They want you to get to the point. They want you to be entertaining, to be engaging. You know, it's okay to be funny, but it's not okay to be too funny. You got to kind of know where that line is. And so I think being in church and understanding, because when you're a person of faith and you believe that the Bible's the Word of God, and you have to present that to people, that's important. And you're trying to communicate something that's important. And as an attorney, when you're trying to communicate the facts of the case and why you think a jury should make a certain decision, they got to know that you believe that. Because if you don't take it seriously, why should they? The office of prosecuting attorney, it's incredibly important for somebody to have a north star of what they believe is right and wrong, and that they stick to it. And obviously none of us are perfect. I'm certainly not either. But I think that you have to have the ability to know what you believe is right, and then to go do it. Now, clearly a prosecutor is bound by the law and what this, I don't write the statutes, the legislature does, and so you got to do that. But it's often been said that a prosecutor is the only lawyer in the American judicial system whose job is to do justice. Now, the trick is figuring out what that is, and that may be different to different people. But for me, it's incredibly important to pursue what we believe is right, and that you can lay your head down at night knowing you did what you thought was best. You did what you thought was the right thing. So I think it's incredibly important for the prosecutor to have a moral sense of right and wrong, and a sense that they are not the law unto themselves, right? Because one of the things that you learn, that I certainly learned growing up is in a preacher's home and believing the Bible, is that morality does not come from within you, right? That this notion that you are your own God, and that what you're, you know, Christians generally do not, I certainly do not believe in the idea of your truth and my truth, right? You and I have opinions, and I believe there is objective truth. And so as a lawyer, it's kind of the same. I'm not a law unto myself, right? And so when prosecutors start to believe that they know better and they can do better, I think that's when they get into trouble. So it's important to know where you're headed. Well, I think the Lord took care of me and did not call me to be a pastor. So it would have taken a strong calling, but he did not. And so I went to college really not knowing a lot what I wanted to do. The first thing I did is I went to Ouachita Baptist University in Arkadelphia. And, most Baptist universities, they try to put that at least 30 miles away from any sin, right? So Arkadelphia is placed, kind of in the middle of nowhere, but it's a great town. And so I went there for school. And when I was there, my freshman year, didn't really know what I wanted to do, but thought, the medical field would be good. And so I majored in chemistry. I majored in biology at first. And it really only took me going through chemistry for 1 year to figure out this was not a good career path for me. And that if by some miracle I made it through, I may end up killing someone. So I thought, I probably don't want to do this. And so I really, the summer between my freshman and sophomore year, changed my mind that I wanted to go to law school, because I had always been very interested in American history and politics and the law, and it was very kind of drawn to that. That was more of something that I was good at, and so switched that major, and then sophomore through senior year majored in history and political science, and then really that whole time thought I wanted to go to law school. And so really got involved in that. And I knew at the time one of my roommates that I had, his dad was and is one of our circuit judges, Judge Scott. And so got to talk to him about that. And so Judge Scott eventually started visiting with me about things I could do during the summers to kind of help me prepare for law school, see if that's what I wanted to do. And so Judge Scott eventually introduced me to the prosecuting attorney at the time, who was Bob Balfe. And Bob just let me start coming in as an intern during the summers. And so I think I started doing that in 2002. And really just I never quit. They couldn't get rid of me. I just kept coming back. I'd just show back up in the summers and they let me do something. And I would do stuff like I would move boxes, I would take orders to judges, I would do the things that no attorney really wanted to do. They did try to have me one time put together a TV stand, because that's back when your computers weren't like they are today, where you could just play everything on the computer. So you had to have a TV and a DVD player, or a VCR player. And so they did try to have me put one of those together one time, and I'm hopeless when it comes to carpentry or anything like that. So didn't succeed there, but tried to just be a guy that would do anything, because I really had the feeling that I wanted to be involved in it. I liked what they did. I do think I related to it in the standpoint of if you're in a trial, you have 12 people and you make your case to them. That was that made sense to me. I like the sense of right and wrong. I like the sense of, trying to convince someone of the rightness of your cause. And I like the idea that you could go home at the end of the day and think that you had made your community better. So I really just started, like I say, interning and just carrying boxes around, getting coffee, going to, back when there was Roy's Office Supply, where I think Table Mesa is now. That was where we got all our, so I'd go over there and buy our stuff and bring it back. And so the prosecutor's office was a lot smaller place then, but that's what I started doing. And eventually they let me start meeting with people that would come in with, citizen complaints, write down their complaint and take it to an attorney and figure out how to deal with it. And so that really, again, was a way to interact with people and get to know how to deal with folks who had been through, even if it was a small problem in comparison to some of the other cases that were here, it was a big problem to them. And so it kind of was a way of forcing you to get involved in caring about other people and their problems and trying to help them.
So when did you become an assistant or a deputy prosecutor, and then how did you move up the ranks? Kind of walk me through that.
So when I graduated college in 2004, I decided by that point I wanted to go to law school, and so I went to the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville from 2004 to 2007, and clerked here pretty much that whole time. And I remember when I got out of law school, I had like every other lawyer, every recent graduate, you're just begging for a job somewhere. And so I think one firm offered me a job that I really didn't want, but I did not want it so bad that I was willing to not eat, so I decided I was going to have to take that. But I remember my boss at the time, Van Stone, called me and offered me a job, and I remember just being like, yes, I don't have to take this other one. And so I called him back and accepted, and then started And the crazy part is about getting a job offer as a prosecutor is typically, you graduate in May, and then you still have to take the bar exam in July, and you don't get the results of that typically till around the end of August or Labor Day. And so you have a job offer contingent upon you passing the bar exam. So I still had to pass the bar exam, and finally after passing that, I was able to start in September of 2007. Well, it's changed tremendously. So in 2007, I'm gonna say we had 15 attorneys. That may be an overstatement of it. We have 22 today. And it's hard to get attorneys approved because you usually can only get attorneys approved in each legislative session, which is every other year. And then you're just in the line with every single other position request in the state of Arkansas, from the state tourism to game and fish to state police to everybody, anything. So they're hard to get. And so the fact that we've grown in that amount of time, I think we have 22 deputy prosecutors now, and we either had 13 or 15 at the time, speaks to the incredible growth. So one is just the size of the office has grown tremendously. And I would say the other thing is just the technological change in how we prosecute cases is drastically different. And part of that is simply in view of the fact that, when I first started, we would literally have those rolly carts where your assistant would bring you boxes of just files, legal size files, and the file would have police reports, criminal histories, witness statements, all your forms that you need to fill out, all that. And so you would literally take that to court, and we would pile those up in the jury box. And as the day would go by, you would take the case out, you would open the flap up, and you would write your notes on your action log of what happened. The defendant appeared with his attorney, the judge said this, set for another hearing, whatever date that is. And so, that was how we did things. And you would have literal paper files. When I first started as a prosecutor, I had a beeper. You had a beeper. And so we would go on call for a week. And your first on call as a deputy prosecutor is always a nightmare, because being the prosecutor, they call you when no one else has answered the question, when no one else has solved the problem, and you're the last stop. There's nobody else. You're it, so like you're either going to solve the problem or it's just going to get worse. And so the worst was when you'd get a phone call and you'd have to call your boss and wake him up in the middle of the night and say, hey, they've got this guy, there's been a homicide, or whatever the case may be. And so it was a different world. It forced you to solve problems. It forced you to confront unique issues. I remember one of the first calls I got, and it's stuff like this you never think about. And they had arrested someone in, I believe it was either Salem Springs or Benton County. I can't remember who had done the arrest, but there was some sort of pursuit that ran into Oklahoma, and the assisting agency in Oklahoma had assisted with the arrest. And so typically, if a person's arrested over there, they're going to have to go through a legal extradition proceeding and all of that. Well, in this case, the guy had a medical issue, and they just brought him back to the hospital in Salem Springs. And so they called me and said, now, should we take him back to Oklahoma for his extradition? I'm like, man, I think he's in the hospital. Let's just leave him. We're just going to call that good. And so there were constantly things like that came up that are unique. But the office changed tremendously. Technologically, certainly in small things. We don't carry a beeper anymore. But also in the way that we manage cases, because it got to the point where if today we wanted to haul around physical files, we literally could not do that. There's no way. It's just too much paper. And so we've transitioned. When I became prosecuting attorney, one of the first things we did was transition to a pretty much fileless office. We've got a couple of dinosaurs who still like files, but for the most part, everything's electronic. It's all on the cloud. It's all virtual. And that makes it both easier to manage and more difficult, in that you have to be a little bit more purposeful, because you don't have a file staring right in front of you. It's on the computer. And so it's changed tremendously, because as we've seen the county grow exponentially, I don't know what the population of the county was in 1996, but I still remember Bentonville in 1996 on the signs was 16,000 people. So it's a lot bigger than that today. We got to be pushing 60,000 people now. And so that really allowed us, that technological change allowed us to advance, but it also brings with it challenges and everything. And then you just manage more people, going from a deputy prosecutor to where, you kind of take problems and there's someone above you to help solve them. Now being the prosecuting attorney, you kind of make the call on things. And so that's a unique challenge. But I think being a deputy prosecutor is just a tremendous privilege, because it gives you the ability to feel like you make a difference in your community and to meet people when they're in a significant time of need. Because I think a lot of people don't understand that when a victim's family member, a victim themselves, comes into the prosecuting attorney's office, they've gone through likely, if not the worst, one of the worst things they've ever been through in their lives. And so I think it's so important for a prosecutor not only to have empathy for that person, but also to have a sense of justice, that what is right in this situation, and go pursue it doggedly. So my boss at the time, I think he called me and one other guy in, that was in February of 2014. It was right before filing period had begun. And he had taken a job at Walmart, and so the next week was filing. And so he said, one of you two guys needs to run, so y'all go fight it out and decide who it's going to be, but I'm only going to back one of you, so you should go decide. And so my buddy and I went off and we had lunch and we talked, and I told him, I said, man, I really want to do this, but if you want to do it, I won't run against you. He kind of said the same, and I think we both meant it, but I think he could tell that I wanted to do it more. And so he came back and said, yeah, I'll support you and everything. Now he's since then gone and become very successful at the Walmart legal department. And I often tell him when we go to lunch that, when I look back on that and think of all that you did to get me elected and all that you did to help me, I could just beat you with a baseball bat. But he did. We worked hard. We had an 89-day campaign because at first we thought, I wouldn't have an opponent. I did. And so we basically had an 89-day race. And so for 89 days, it's hard to get anybody to care about anything in 3 months. And so for 89 days, my friends and I, my family, knocked on doors, raised money, talked to people. And so that in and of itself is an ordeal, because you go talk to people, right? You listen to their concerns, you care about them. And it's funny, at the time, I was 31 years old when I ran for prosecutor, which seemed at the time to be plenty old, right? But for a lot of people, that seems very young. Now I'm 40 now, and so it seems a lot younger than it did at the time. But at the time, I couldn't understand why people cared about it, because I'm like, man, I'm a grown man. What are you talking about? I'm 31 years old. And so you constantly have to convince people that you were old enough to do this job. And so remember the last day of that campaign, I think it was the day before the election, and I had some cases, and so I just went to court, to prosecute, to, call my cases and do everything. And several people were just like, what are you doing here? Why are you here? It's the day before the election. And I remember I told them, I said, well, the hay is in the barn, man. This cake is baked. I've done everything I can do for 89 days. Like, it's over now. And they're like, you need to go at least do something. You'll make yourself feel better. So what's funny is my mother the entire time had told me that I really want to go one time with you when you knock on doors. Now, today in Benton County, I don't even know if you could knock on doors in a county-wide race. The county's just too big, but we were still doing that at the time. So what was really useful is if you could get somebody to drive you, and you could just hop out, knock on a door, talk to a voter, hop back in and go. It was a lot of time saver, so I always had someone drive me. So Mom she was always saying that she really wanted to go with me. So this last day I called her and said, hey, I don't have anybody to take me. If you want to go, let's go. And so we did. She was driving a minivan at that time. And so I remember I went to Bella Vista, and I knocked on this lady's door, and she was very nice, but she said, listen, I just don't know. I mean, you are so young. You're 31 years old. How are you going to do this job? And so I'm trying to convince her that I can do it. I'm saying, here's all the cases I prosecuted. Here's who I'm endorsed by, and all that, trying to really sell her. And so it's a 15-minute conversation. It's not a short conversation, but for whatever reason, it was the last day I decided, hey, this lady hadn't voted yet. I'm going to win her. I'm going to get this vote right here. And so she she finally was like, well, I think I can do it. I think you know, you're young, but you may have convinced me. And so I've about got her convinced that, you know, I'm her guy and she can vote for me despite my age. And so my mom, keep in mind, is in her van on the street waiting on me. And so this lady finally goes, now, who is that over there? And I turn around to point, and at that time, my mother has rolled down her window and is taking a picture of our interaction with her cell phone. And I said, oh, that's just my mom. She's driving me around today. And so I think I may have lost that lady at that point. But the election itself was, I mean, what you learn is when you go do that, it doesn't matter what I think about myself. I may have thought at 31 it was fine and I should have done it. It doesn't matter what I think. It matters what the voters think, right? That's all that matters is what they think. And you got to talk about their issues. And so I think it's a healthy experience, certainly for political candidates, because it takes your focus off of yourself and forces you to care about what they care about. And it's not unlike dealing with a jury, because I often tell, you know, prosecutors, the jury will not hear the case that you know. They'll hear the case that you try. They'll hear the case that's admitted into evidence. They'll hear those facts, not everything else rolling around in your head. So if you want them to know it, you better tell them. And it's important in the jury selection process that you care about the issues that they bring up. And elections are that way. You got to care about the issues that people care about. And so it was a unique experience in that, man, you're forced to interact with so many people that you wouldn't otherwise. And I think it helps you become a more well-rounded person and a better official as well, because you get a sense of what people care about in different parts of your community. Because certainly living in Bentonville, I don't interact with Siloam Springs that much. I just don't. I go over there every now and then, or Gentry, or you know, parts of Rogers. So you go different places and hear different perspectives, and I think that's healthy for someone campaigning for office, and certainly as a prosecuting attorney, because your goal is to do what you feel is just in an individual case. And I think that not only comes from your own moral core and your moral sense, but also knowing what would the people of Benton County think about this case if it was in front of a jury. And so when you interact with people on that basis, you really get a sense of what they want, what they believe, and what they expect. Well, so I was the first group of prosecutors that had to run as nonpartisan candidates. And I think the thinking behind that was, you know, if we take the R and the D out of it, people will, you know, check their politics at the door. Now, I do believe that even before prosecutors and judges were nonpartisan, I do believe that they followed the law and, you know, did what they thought was right, irrespective of party affiliation. But people always bring in who they are and what they believe to everything. So, but yeah, people would immediately want to know, are you Republican or Democrat? So I would tell them, you can't put I can't say that I'm a Republican on the voter form. They want you to know what you thought about certain issues that may or may not have something to do with crime. And like, that's just one of those examples of what they care about is what you talk about. Now, when it comes to crime, what people want is what everybody wants. They want a safe community. They want to be able to have their kids walk down the street. They want to be able to go places late at night, not worry about getting robbed. They want to live in a community where they have safety. You know, and the criminal informations that we file that charges someone with a crime, one piece of language called the to-wit language by law is in every criminal information. And when you charge them with a crime, it's, let's say you charge them with robbery, well, the last language of that is against the peace and dignity of the state of Arkansas, is what is in every criminal information. And that's always stood out to me, because that really is what a safe community is supposed to give us, is peace and dignity. That you can go places without fear, that you don't have to worry about your children, you don't have to worry about your community, that you know that as a law-abiding citizen, you're able to exercise all of your constitutional rights, you're able to pursue happiness, you're able to do what you want to do without fear of crime, of extortion, of all the things we see in so many other countries where they don't have the same adherence to the rule of law that we do. And so that's what people want. Now, however they verbalize it may be different, but that's what they want. They want a sense of safety. And prosecutors and police in some ways are almost like referees in a baseball game. If it's done right, you kind of don't know that they're there, right? And so if public safety is handled correctly, people can go about their lives with minimal intrusion from the government, and I think that's what people want. If you look at us, so we file somewhere in the neighborhood, and in 2011, I ran the numbers the other day, in 2011 this office opened around 1,700 felony cases, 1,1800, and that's probably understating it a little bit in that we file multiple charges on one criminal information. But at least 1,700 felony cases were opened. Well, this year and the last couple of years, even during the pandemic, we've been looking right around 3,000 felony cases, sometimes a little bit more than that. And so with that level of growth, if we wanted to try, let's take 1 year and say we wanted to have jury trials on more than 3,000 felony cases, it'd take us a decade, maybe more, to do it. It would simply be impossible. And so the way the legal system deals with that fact is to allow the use of plea bargaining. And plea bargaining is what keeps you up at night as a prosecutor. Because a plea bargain is not struck based on always what you think should happen, but what you think the evidence merits, what the strength of your evidence can dictate. And that's really what it comes down to, is how strong is your case. And weaker cases get pled down for lesser time than stronger cases do, sometimes irrespective of the charge. And so what you do there, I would say somewhere around 95 to 98% of all cases, maybe more than that, are resolved in a plea bargain, because what happens is the state, the prosecutor, and the defense come together and have a kind of a mutual agreement after a lot of fighting back and forth, because it's adversarial, to say this is an agreement that we can live with. By its very nature, a plea agreement is going to include less prison time or less punishment than the parties believe a jury would give, right? Or otherwise, why plea it? If you're in the defendant's position, then the judge has to approve it. But the reason to do it is, from a prosecutor's perspective, there comes a point at which you believe going to trial is either unadvisable for some reason, maybe the victim's family doesn't want to go through it, maybe they don't want to testify, or you believe the case is weak enough that the risk of an acquittal is high enough that it's just not wise to do that. And so those are difficult decisions of judgment, right? It's not hard to determine. Cases where you have a confession or DNA in some ways are easy, because you can kind of dictate the outcome that in a perfect world that you want. Most cases aren't that way. Most cases are very difficult, and the entire legal system is set up to restrain government power against a citizen, against a defendant. And so the state bears the burden of proving its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The defendant doesn't have to do anything. The defendant doesn't have to testify, doesn't have to tell his side of the story. The jury can even leave there thinking the defendant probably did it. But if we haven't proved our case beyond a reasonable doubt, then the jury is instructed to find him not guilty. And so the plea bargaining system really injects a lot of judgment into the criminal justice system, to where you have to determine what is the appropriate punishment in this case in view of how strong the facts are. And that's where I think knowing not only what you believe is right, but knowing your community and being able to know what they would think is right. And the way you do that is you talk to them, you have jury trials where they make decisions, and you try to do the best you can going forward. But certainly plea bargaining is the majority of the way that most cases get resolved. Now, you'll hear some law professors and criminologists attack the issue of plea bargaining as somehow unfair to a defendant, and it's important to remember that the defendant always has a right to a jury trial. A defendant can always go face a jury of his peers and say, I didn't do this, or maybe I committed some lesser crime but not the one I'm charged with. So that constitutional protection always affords the defendant the right to reject a plea offer and go to trial. But in the legal system, most lawyers and most defendants kind of get a sense of what a jury is likely to do. Again, for the issue for the defendant is different than for the state. For a prosecutor, what you got to be worried about is if you lose one juror, you're not getting a conviction, right? And so there are different incentives there. But certainly, as the prosecuting attorney, I certainly feel the burden of making sure we do our very best to get it right. We don't always get it right, but we always want to be making decisions that are intended not to just get us out of a difficult position or a bad case, but to do the right thing as best we can. My experience is from 2007 until today, judges would vastly prefer people to reform and not go to prison. You know, as a deputy prosecutor, because everybody has different roles. I found myself early on as a deputy prosecutor probably being, I joke with people that I may be getting soft now, but I think you prosecute enough people and you just kind of interact with them. You know, early on in my career, I was probably far more, maybe harsh isn't the right word, but you just had a far more sense of saying, hey, listen, if you know, X equals Y, right? And then the more you do it, the more you sense that, well, if we have the opportunity to reform this person short of them going to prison, we should do that, right? Because then everybody wins. And I think judges take that responsibility seriously. So I know as a prosecutor, I was constantly pushing judges on someone's third or fourth parole violation, or third or fourth probation revocation rather, to send this person to prison. They weren't complying, they weren't doing this. And judges always, I felt like, had the sense of wanting to give that person enough room to come back around. Because when they do, everybody wins with that. But I think as prosecutors, our primary obligation, and I think this is an important worldview distinction, is to do not what may be best for a defendant, but what is best for your community. What is best for your community. And those often are at odds, right? It may not be the best thing for a defendant to go to prison, but it may be what your community needs. It may not be the best thing for a host of reasons that relate to the defendant, but it's what's going to keep your community safe. And those are judgment calls. Those are difficult. And I think judges wrestle with that. I think prosecutors wrestle with it. But a lot of times that people end up going to prison today is going to be for serious crimes or repeat offenders, kind of like you mentioned, people who have been through the system before, and judges feel like they're out of options with how to address that behavior. You know, early on, one of the more interesting cases I had as a deputy prosecutor early on, there was a mayor of Centerton whose name that he had become the mayor under was Ken Williams. Well, it turned out that Ken Williams was actually a man named Don LaRose. And Don LaRose had, through a real circuitous road, had basically taken off, abandoned his family. He actually was a Baptist preacher, believe it or not, in the state of Maine, which was almost unbelievable to me. I remember I called the little town in Maine because I could not believe there was a Baptist church anywhere in the state of Maine, but sure enough there was. And so he had basically abandoned his family and assumed a new identity and moved down here, became the mayor of Centerton. Apparently did a pretty good job as mayor of Centerton until I prosecuted him for forgery on his political practices document. And so that, you know, again, it was not something that where he was a serious threat to the community, but he'd certainly defrauded the voting public in not saying who he really was. So you get, as a prosecutor, you get very interesting, unique things like that almost, you know, would seem inconceivable to you.
What was the resolution of the case?
I think we pled him.
Remorseful?
I think he was. We pled him to, I think it was a deal where basically, hey, if you resign, we'll give you probation, which we did. And I think he's passed away now. But I think that he had different stories than I think I probably thought was accurate. But his thing was, listen, I got into trouble. I felt people were after me and I needed a new identity. And he had a friend, I think his brother's best friend had drowned when they were kids. And his name was Ken Williams. And so in the 70s, I suppose you could just walk into a Social Security office and say, I lost my card. And he knew his date of birth and for growing up with him. And they gave him a new Social Security card as Ken Williams. Yeah. And so he somehow came down here to work for a radio station, became fairly prominent. He was elected mayor. And so it's weird. And then you've got, you know, there are always murder cases and things that stand out to you. Just in the pain that it causes families. I know I've prosecuted several cases that involve the homicides of children that are just unbelievable. That you would think a person can do that. And I think, and they shock the community. They shock people that it can happen here. And so, you know, those cases are difficult to prosecute, but they're very rewarding. It's why you do what you do. to prosecute cases that matter. Some of the most difficult decisions, I think, for a prosecutor, maybe the most difficult decision, is the choice not to prosecute someone, the choice to dismiss charges. I think it's very difficult. I had a case involving I would call it a suspected homicide. Other folks probably have different opinions. But it became prominent because the person suspected of committing the crime had an Amazon Echo device in their house, and we did search warrants for that. And so Amazon was, as you might imagine, very reticent to give us that information. We eventually did get it because the defendant consented to it. There was nothing of evidentiary value on there. But again, it was one of the first things that happened that I really, because as a deputy prosecutor, you don't know about the media interest or anything like that. And so being the elected prosecutor at the time, getting phone calls from and emails and media requests from, I'm telling you, every single major newspaper and technology outlet in the United States. Because I think that was 2015, late 2015. So these sort of smart home devices were still relatively new. People didn't know how they worked. Amazon was claiming at the time that it wasn't always listening unless you say the word Alexa. By the way, it is absolutely listening all the time. I don't care what they say, but they're very, very keen to not litigate that issue. But at the end of that case, I met with defense experts and really examined the case, and for various reasons decided, listen, no matter what I think may have happened, I know that we cannot prove this case. I do not believe in this case beyond a reasonable doubt. And those are very, very difficult decisions, and I think that's where it's important to have your own sense of, hey, listen, the public expects you to take your obligation, your legal duty seriously, and to not use the power of the state to prosecute someone when the evidence does not support that. And so those are difficult decisions, and it's, one of the most important things a prosecutor does is to make unpopular decisions, because obviously the easy thing to do is just file a charge, put the case in front of the jury, and let them do what they do. But that's not my obligation. My obligation is to pursue the evidence and apply the law to facts, and to follow my ethical duties strictly, and to understand my obligation. Because at times I hated this phrase, but it's probably accurate. I heard of a judge who used to say that the state of Arkansas never wins or loses a trial. The state is satisfied with a just verdict, whatever that is. Now, as a deputy prosecutor, I'm like, well, dadgum right, we want to win. Why are we sitting here if we don't want to win? Of course I want to win. But I do think, certainly as the elected prosecuting attorney, I certainly have a sense of the importance of doing justice. And sometimes in the American legal system, the whole legal system is not set up equally. It is set up to favor the defendant. And even as a prosecutor, I think you have to recognize that. And so the choices of which charges not to file, I think, are sometimes the most difficult. And then the cases that involve just horrific murders or crimes and dealing with families. Now, you do get some very big wins, moments that I don't think you get in any other job as a lawyer. We prosecuted a man named Grant Harden for murder several years back. He murdered a man in Garfield, or in Gateway, Arkansas, excuse me, and murdered a man over there. And so he murdered a man named Mr. Appleton. And so we prosecuted him for that. And I remember at the time there was a search issue or something that was a little bit unique, where I remember talking with the family, being a little concerned about, not that we would lose, but again, we reached that point at which you think they've offered this plea offer, and I think that's reached the point on the scale that I'm not comfortable rejecting it, with the knowledge that there is a slight chance we have a real problem, right? And so we agreed to that plea agreement. I think we pled him to 30 years in prison on murder in the first degree. Well, then he gets down to prison and they draw his DNA, as they're required to do by law. And at that time it hit, and he was the assailant, he was the criminal in a 1997 cold case that involved the rape of Roger's school teacher. That was committed on a Sunday morning while this teacher was working by herself. And so, again, he was never in the universe of suspects. And so that victim, a lady named Amy Harrison, got to come back and get justice, and he was convicted of that crime. And so things like that just, man, they give you a satisfaction that I think you can't get. It's very difficult to get in any other area of the practice of law. So and it's one of those things that keep you going. I mean, there's a lot of hard things about it, but it's very rewarding. Certainly for Benton County, we have a very close relationship with law enforcement. And, we go on call and assist in investigations and things like that. So it's so important for prosecutors, I think, to understand their job and what they do, so that they're not always making these decisions based on what they read on a page, but what it's like for a police officer to go serve a search warrant for, if you've ever been to the scene of a major crime and you see them with, floodlights and, hazmat suits and all these things that they're doing to clear out a house or look for evidence and things like that. Those are that's a difficult job, and I promise you, most people would not do it. And so people who serve as police officers are unique individuals, and so it gives me a real sense of our obligation to go see that through. And, mindful of our ethical duties and all the things that we have to do to make sure that we, prosecute cases so that the work of law enforcement isn't in vain in working on them. It's important to have a sense of why you're doing what you're doing, that you want to do the right thing, and that you kind of put blinders on. And there's a lot of times where a prosecutor, you'd like to say things that you can't. You'd like to do things that you can't. There's a famous Supreme Court opinion that's quoted in every conference you go to as a prosecutor. It's called Berger versus United States. And the Supreme Court, their Justice Robert Jackson, who served as a prosecutor at Nuremberg, is writing this majority opinion about the duties of, in that case, a United States attorney, but it can apply to any prosecutor. And he's talking about the unique position of a prosecutor as a minister of justice, right? That you don't serve the needs of your client, because most lawyers, their ethical duty and what they should do is serve the needs of their client, whether they agree with them or not, because this is an adversarial process, whether civil or criminal. And so someone's got to advocate for a client's position, because the whole purpose of the legal system is to ensure we're not out here in the street clubbing each other to death right over a disagreement. And so that's a lawyer's job, is to advocate vigorously on their client's behalf. But a prosecutor's job is different, and Justice Jackson wrote, I think very eloquently there, that a prosecutor serves as a minister of justice. And while prosecutors are allowed to strike hard blows, they are not permitted to strike foul ones. And I think that's a really good North Star for prosecutors, is to understand that, listen, you fight as hard as you can and do all you can do within the confines of the law, but you can't go outside of it. You can't get up there and say things that you shouldn't say. You can't get up an opening statement and say, well, that defendant's sitting over there for some reason. The police wouldn't have arrested him unless he was guilty. You can't say that. You have to stay within the confines of the law. And so I think for prosecutors, it's just so important to have your own moral sense of what you're doing and why you're doing it, to be aggressive in fighting for justice, but to understand the other side of it is the necessary restraint on prosecutorial and government power that the Constitution imposes, and to respect that, because it not only, sometimes it's frustrating because well, shoot, this guy sitting over here is guilty of sin, and I wish we could tell him about the 10 other crimes he's committed, But again, even though a lot of those protections favor guilty defendants, and they almost always do, it's important. They're important to respect because they protect all of us as Americans.
What can you tell me about your previous prosecutors here? You worked with Benton Stone?
So Bob Balfe initially hired me. I worked under him I think I was an intern under him, and he was nice enough to just let me do stuff around here. I probably didn't have any business working here, but I bothered them enough that they would let me come. And then I worked, Robin Green, who's now one of our circuit judges, was a prosecutor here. I worked for her, and then worked for Van Stone. And so under Van, I was a law clerk, and he let me work on homicide cases and everything, even though I didn't know anything about what I was doing, because you're in law, you realize after you get out of law school that law school itself has almost no relation to the actual practice of law, right? Law school is just a war of attrition where you learn how to, take tests and everything. And then when you get out, you're like, oh, I have to apply all this stuff to actual real world experiences. So yeah, I would do stuff like I'd work on research for murder cases. I would listen to jail calls that defendants would make. I would, go, try to track down witnesses and things like that. I would say that the more places that I go and I've been fortunate enough to go a lot of different places in the United States and internationally a few times as well. The more places I go, the more I appreciate Benton County. Benton County is a phenomenal place to live. It's got great people who live here. It's got, I would say, one of the most dynamic economies that you would find anywhere in terms of the ability to move up the socioeconomic ladder, to raise a family, to enjoy life. I think it's one of the best places that you can live. And there are things that you can do here. There are very few things you can't do here that you can do in a major city anymore. I mean, there's so many opportunities here. They're really unrivaled in terms of the quality of life that you get here, because you still get a small town feel in Benton County, even though it's becoming more and more populous all the time. You still get that small town feel. People expect you to interact that way. There's very much a neighborliness, if that's a word, that people have here that I think is refreshing and makes it a great place to live. And I think for having children going other places, they're starting to recognize how good it is to live here. We're very fortunate to live here. So what I would tell people is I think Benton County is the best place to live in the United States. I mean, it's where I choose to live, and if I thought there was somewhere better, I'd go there. So I really do believe, I think it's a great place to live, and I think we're fortunate for the folks who have invested here in businesses and with financial investments and things like that to make this such a unique and blessed place to be able to live. My favorite thing about Benton County is its home. I would say Benton County, not only is it home because I've lived here a long time, but it feels like home. And I think the unique thing about Benton County is that there are so many people who move here from other places that folks are welcoming. It's not unique to be new here. It's not unique at all. And I think people are just used to, kind of including people. And so I think it's a place where not only is it home for those of us who've lived here for a long time, there are people who've been here a lot longer than me, but it's home for people who moved here a week ago. And I think that's a unique thing about Benton County, is that it is an inclusive place for folks who want a better life, who want to come here and raise a family. And I think that's a very unique thing. And I think that is my favorite thing about Benton County, is that it is home. And I think it's home for folks who've lived here for a long time, and even folks who've just got here.